I bought my own house and allowed my daughter and her unemployed husband to live with me. Then he invited his parents to move in and demanded my room. When I refused, they threw out my things into the garage. So I gave them 24 hours to leave, promising they'd face consequences for their betrayal they'd never forget. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Ralph Stone. I'm 68 years old and I live in Nashville, Tennessee, have for most of my life. I spent 31 years as a senior archivist at the Tennessee State Library and Archives on 7th Avenue North. Retired 3 years ago. Some people collect stamps, some play golf. I work with wood. My garage on 1847 Cedarwood Drive has a proper workshop. Hand planes, chisels, a dovetail saw. I build small furniture in wooden boxes. It's how I think. It's how I breathe. I bought the house for $312,000. Cash, no mortgage. 2 stories, 2,100 square feet. A master bedroom upstairs that gets the morning light just right. The first year alone in that house was the quietest, most peaceful year of my life. I'd wake up at 6, make coffee, spend an hour in the workshop before breakfast. Thursday mornings, I'd walk to Frothy Monkey on 12 South for eggs and a newspaper. Nobody asked me for anything. Nobody rearranged my kitchen. Nobody told me I was doing something wrong in my own home. I had a routine, and the routine had a rhythm, and the rhythm was mine. After 31 years of organizing other people's histories, I finally had my own. Quiet, orderly, and exactly the way I wanted it. That changed in September of last year. My daughter Tara showed up on a Tuesday evening, unannounced. She's 34 now, married to Kyle Fleming for 4 years. When she walked through my front door, her eyes were red, and her voice had that particular tremble she's used since she was 9 years old. The one that means she needs something. "Dad, we can't make rent this month," she said. "Kyle's about to sign a contract with a construction company. Big one. We just need a couple of months to get back on our feet." $1,650 a month, their apartment cost. I know because she told me 3 times, as if repetition made the number more tragic. Now let me tell you about Kyle. I spent 31 years handling documents. Land deeds, wills, contracts, letters that decided the fate of families and fortunes. You develop a sense for authenticity. You learn to spot the forgeries, not from the ink or the paper, from the weight of the words. Real documents have gravity. Fakes have performance. Kyle Fleming is a performance. He's 37, built like someone who once played sports, but quit before it mattered. Talks with his hands a lot, big gestures, wide smiles. When he explained his business plans to me that evening, he hit every mark. Confident tone, optimistic projections, names of companies I couldn't verify. But here's what I noticed, what the archivist in me couldn't ignore. He never looked me in the eyes when he talked about work. Not once. His gaze would drift to the window, to the floor, to some invisible point over my left shoulder. People who are telling the truth don't need to find a safe place to look. I also noticed this. He described the construction company opportunity in 4 sentences, but couldn't name his future supervisor. He said the contract is practically done, but didn't know the start date. The details weren't vague. They were absent, like a document with a beautiful wax seal and no signature. But Tara was sitting across from me, and her eyes were wet, and she was my daughter. 6 months, I said. Maximum. Kyle looks for work. Real work. That's the condition. Kyle reached across the table and shook my hand. Firm grip, wide smile, direct eye contact. The first time he'd looked at me straight all evening. Funny how that works. People look you in the eye when they're sealing a deal, not when they're telling you why the deal matters. "You won't regret this, Ralph," he said. Ralph, not Dad, not even Mr. Stone. Just Ralph, like we were business partners splitting a tab. They moved in 3 days later. I expected a few suitcases, maybe some kitchen things. What I got was a rental truck, a full-size one, 14 boxes, a flat-screen television that was bigger than my dining table, a gaming console with a tangle of cables, and a dog. A 70-pound mixed breed named Buster with no training and an appetite for anything left below counter height. Nobody mentioned the dog before move-in day. I stood in the driveway and watched Kyle direct Tara on where to put the boxes, leaning against the truck with his phone in one hand and a protein shake in the other. He pointed. She carried. I remember thinking, this is how he operates. Not lazy, exactly. Strategic. He positions himself where the work isn't. That first night, the four of us sat at the kitchen table. Me, Tara, Kyle, and the ghost of the conversation we weren't having. Kyle talked about the market, opportunities, and networking. Tara nodded at everything he said like she was keeping time to music only she could hear. I ate my soup and listened. After dinner, Kyle shook my hand again. Same firm grip, same smile. "This is going to work out great," he said. "Family helping family. That's what it's all about." I nodded. I cleared the table, washed my bowl and dried it. Put it back on the shelf. The same spot. The same way I'd done it every night for a year. And in my head, the archivist filed a note. A small one, almost invisible, but there. He didn't ask what the conditions were. He shook on a deal without asking for the terms. In 31 years of reading documents, I've learned one thing. The people who don't ask about the terms already know they don't plan to follow them. 10 months later, and the construction contract had never materialized. Neither had the restaurant franchise idea that replaced it, nor the online reselling business after that, nor the consulting firm that Kyle discussed loudly on the phone for 2 weeks before it vanished from conversation like smoke from a candle. 6 ideas in 10 months. Not one of them made it past the talking stage. I know, because I kept count. The archivist doesn't turn off just because you retire. But the ideas weren't the problem. The problem was what happened in my house while Kyle was busy not working. It started small. Around the 3rd month, Kyle moved a desk and a second monitor into the 3rd bedroom, the one I'd been using for storage. "Just temporary," he said. "I need a proper space for business planning." He said it the way people say, just the tip of the iceberg, casually as if the mass underneath doesn't exist. I came home from volunteering at the library one afternoon and found the door closed with a handwritten sign. "Office, please knock, in my house." Month 5, Tara repainted the kitchen, didn't ask. I came back from my Thursday breakfast at Frothy Monkey and the walls were sage green instead of the warm cream I'd chosen when I bought the place. "It was looking dated, Dad," she said, tilting her head the way she does when she's already decided the conversation is over. "This is more modern." I looked at the walls. I looked at her. I didn't say anything. Not because I agreed, because I was cataloging. An archivist's instinct. When things start changing around you, you start keeping records. Month 7 was when Buster got into my workshop. I build wooden boxes, jewelry boxes, keepsake boxes, the kind of thing you give someone when you want them to have something made by hand, not by machine. I'd been working on a walnut box with dovetail joints for 3 weeks. The grain was perfect, tight, dark, with a natural wave I'd never seen in walnut before. I'd finished the sanding that morning and the box was sitting on the lower shelf of my workbench, waiting for the first coat of oil. Kyle left the garage door open. Buster found the box. When I came downstairs, the walnut box was in 4 pieces on the garage floor, covered in teeth marks and drool. 3 weeks of work. Gone. I picked up the largest piece and held it, running my thumb along the shattered dovetail joint. Kyle appeared in the doorway, saw the mess, and shrugged. Actually shrugged. Both shoulders up, palms open, the universal gesture for not my problem. "It's just wood, Ralph," he said. "Just wood." I stared at him for a long time. Long enough for his smile to thin out and his eyes to slide away from mine. "I've been told my silence makes people uncomfortable." Good. I tried talking. Twice. The first time was in March, at dinner. I set down my fork and said clearly, "Kyle, it's been 6 months. We agreed on 6 months. What's the plan?" Tara's eyes filled with tears before I finished the sentence. Like a reflex. Pull the pin, release the water. "Dad, you don't understand the pressure he's under. The job market is impossible right now. You're being so selfish." Kyle reached over and put his hand on her arm, the comforting husband. "It's okay, babe. Your dad has a right to ask." Then he turned to me with that look. Patient, tolerant, slightly condescending. Like I was a difficult relative he had to manage. Ralph, I've got 3 leads right now. Serious ones. Give me another month. I gave him 3. The second conversation went almost identically. Same tears from Tara. Same calm reassurance from Kyle. Same empty promise with a different deadline. This time he mentioned stress and negotiations and something about the economy. I nodded, cleared my plate, and went to the garage. That night, I opened the drawer of my workbench and pulled out a notebook. A hardbound leather one I'd bought years ago and never used. I sat down on my shop stool and wrote the date. Then I wrote everything I remembered. The conversation, the words used, the tears, the promises. I started photographing things too. The office sign on the 3rd bedroom door, the sage green kitchen walls, the remains of the walnut box. I didn't know yet what I'd do with any of it. But 31 years as an archivist teaches you something fundamental. Documents always become useful. Maybe not today, maybe not next month. But the moment you need proof that something happened, the only thing that matters is whether you wrote it down. By June, the notebook had 17 entries, 17 dated records of conversations, incidents, and changes made to my house without my consent. I kept it in the bottom drawer of my workbench, under a stack of sandpaper. Nobody ever looks under sandpaper. On the last day of June, I was in the garage oiling a set of chisels when I heard Kyle's voice through the door that connects to the kitchen. He was on the phone, didn't know I was within earshot. His tone was different from the one he used with me. Lighter, conspiratorial. The voice of a man making arrangements. I couldn't hear most of it. The garage door muffles sound. But 2 words came through the crack where the door doesn't quite meet the frame. 2 words, clear as a chisel strike on dry oak. They agreed to come. I set down the chisel. I closed the oil tin, and I sat very still on my shop stool, listening to the silence that followed. They, not he, not she. They. Someone was coming, and Kyle hadn't mentioned a word to me about it. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote down the date, the time, and those 4 words. Then I closed it, slid it back under the sandpaper, and went to bed. The archivist in me wasn't worried yet, but he was paying very close attention. I didn't have to wait long to find out who they were. 3 days after that phone call, Kyle sat down across from me at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, with the sage green walls I hadn't chosen, and delivered what he clearly considered wonderful news. So, Ralph, great thing. My parents are going to stay with us for a bit, just a few weeks. They're having some issues with their rental situation in Memphis, and they need a place to land while they sort it out. His parents, Noel and Barbara Fleming. I'd met them twice, once at the wedding, once at a Thanksgiving dinner that lasted 4 hours longer than it should have. Noel was a retired small-time contractor from Memphis who treated every room he walked into like a job site he'd been hired to criticize. Barbara was the kind of woman who never said anything directly, but communicated everything through sighs, raised eyebrows, and the strategic rearrangement of other people's belongings. "Where exactly will they be staying?" I asked. "Well, there's the guest room," Kyle said. "The guest room is 180 square feet with 1 twin bed." Kyle smiled. It was the smile he used when he was about to suggest something outrageous and wanted it to sound reasonable. I'd cataloged that smile months ago. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," he said, leaning back in his chair like a man settling into a negotiation he'd already won. "Your bedroom is way bigger, 430 square feet, right? You could move downstairs. The couch in the living room folds out pretty well, and honestly, you spend most of your time in the garage anyway." I looked at him. I counted to 7 in my head. Slowly, the way I do when I want someone to feel the weight of silence before I speak. Kyle's smile held for about 4 seconds. Then it started to thin at the edges. "No," I said. 1 word. No explanation, no justification, no negotiation. My house, my bedroom. No. Kyle opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in the way a man nods when he's filing something away for later. They arrived the next morning. A silver pickup truck with Tennessee plates pulled into my driveway carrying 3 suitcases, 2 cardboard boxes, and 2 people who walked through my front door like they were returning home from a long trip. Noel Fleming was 64 years old and built like a man who'd spent decades lifting things and telling other people they were lifting them wrong. Within the first hour, he'd walked through every room in my house and offered commentary on each one. "These door hinges are mounted backward," he announced in the hallway, loud enough for the entire house to hear. "And this baseboard, you see that gap? That's a 1/4-inch gap. That's amateur work." He said this in my house, a house I bought with my own money, a house where every door opens and closes exactly as it should. Barbara was quieter but more surgical. She didn't critique, she corrected. By evening, the kitchen counter had been reorganized. My coffee mugs were in a different cabinet. The dish soap had moved from the left side of the sink to the right. When I opened the cabinet where I kept my spice rack, the spices were alphabetized. I had never alphabetized my spices in 68 years of life, and I wasn't planning to start. On the second day, I found new curtains in the living room. Floral print, heavy fabric. They blocked the afternoon light that I'd specifically chosen that room for. Barbara was sitting on the couch beneath them, reading a magazine, and when I walked in, she looked up with an expression that said, "You're welcome." I didn't say anything. I went to the garage and wrote it down. By the 5th day, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a hotel where I happened to have the worst room. Noel's voice filled every hallway. Barbara's touches appeared in every corner. Kyle walked through it all with the satisfied ease of a man watching his plan come together. And Tara, my daughter, moved through the house like a supporting character in someone else's production, agreeing with everything, challenging nothing. That evening, they gathered in the living room, all 4 of them sitting across from me like a committee. Kyle spoke first, naturally. He always spoke first. "Ralph, we've been talking, and we think it makes the most sense for you to take the downstairs. Mom and Dad need proper space. They're the senior couple in the house, and the master bedroom is the only room that really works for them. It's the practical solution." The senior couple, in my house, needing my room. The practical solution. I looked at each of them in turn. Kyle, confident, chin slightly raised. Tara, eyes down, picking at the hem of her shirt. Noel, arms crossed, feet planted wide, the posture of a man who expects to be obeyed. Barbara, hands folded in her lap, watching me with the patient expression of someone waiting for the inevitable. "This is my room," I said, "in my house. The answer is no." The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Noel uncrossed his arms and started to say something, but Kyle touched his shoulder and shook his head slightly. The gesture was subtle. The meaning wasn't, "Not now. We'll handle this differently." Kyle looked at me one last time before they all dispersed. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It was something colder, the look of a man who'd already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. I went to bed that night and locked my bedroom door. I'd never locked it before. Not once in 2 years of living in that house. But I turned that lock, and I lay in the dark, and I listened to the unfamiliar sounds of 4 people moving through my home like they owned it. And I thought, something is going to happen. Soon. I should have trusted that instinct. The next morning, I left for my walk at 7:15, same as always. An hour out to Radnor Lake State Park and back. 3.5 miles round trip, my daily routine since I moved to Cedarwood Drive. Clear sky, warm air, the kind of Tennessee summer morning that makes you forget your problems for exactly as long as you're outside. When I turned back onto my street, I saw the boxes before I saw anything else. 3 cardboard boxes, 2 suitcases, and my wooden tool chest, the one with my best chisels and hand planes inside, all stacked neatly beside the garage door. Neatly, as if care had been taken, as if someone wanted me to understand that this wasn't chaos. This was a decision. I walked closer. The boxes were labeled in Tara's handwriting. Dad's clothes, Dad's books, bathroom stuff. Clean, round letters, written with a black marker. She'd taken the time to label them. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else that morning. I went upstairs. The door to my bedroom, the master bedroom, 430 square feet, the room where I'd slept every night for 2 years, had a new lock on it, a deadbolt. Brass-colored, freshly installed, screws still shiny. Noel's work, the man was a contractor after all. I later found out he'd done it in about 40 minutes. Fast work. Almost professional. I suppose he finally found a job he was motivated to complete. I stood in the hallway and looked at that lock for a long time. Behind me, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Tara appeared first, holding a coffee mug. My coffee mug, the blue one I'd used every morning for 3 years. She took a sip and said, in a voice so casual it sounded rehearsed, "It's better this way, Dad. For everyone." Kyle was right behind her, leaning against the wall. "You're in the garage most of the time anyway, Ralph. This just makes sense." Makes sense. Better for everyone. The language of people who've already taken what they want and need you to agree. It was reasonable. Noel's voice drifted up from downstairs. "Barb, you want me to move the dresser to the left wall or keep it where it is?" They were already rearranging my furniture, inside my locked bedroom, while I stood in the hallway holding nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I've never raised my voice. Not in 31 years of dealing with people who tried to forge documents, alter records, or claim ownership of things that didn't belong to them. You don't beat those people by shouting. You beat them with paper. I turned around and walked downstairs, past Noel, past Barbara, who was hanging a new set of curtains in my bedroom window, and into the garage. I opened my laptop on the workbench. The screen lit up, and I did 3 things in order. First, I took photographs. Every box, every suitcase, the tool chest, the new lock on the bedroom door, close-ups of the screws, the deadbolt, Tara's handwriting on the labels. My phone stamped each photo with a time, 8:52 a.m. Second, I sent a message, a short one, to a number I'd saved weeks ago, after an evening spent reading online reviews. The office of Diego Ramirez, housing and property attorney, 224th Avenue North, Suite 312, 4.8 stars, 214 reviews. I'd found him the same way I found everything, carefully, thoroughly, and well in advance of needing him. Third, I walked back into the living room. All 4 of them were there. Kyle on the couch, Tara in the armchair, Noel standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, Barbara in the kitchen doorway. They looked at me the way you look at someone you've already defeated, with a mixture of pity and impatience. I spoke without raising my voice, without pausing, without looking away. "You have 24 hours to pack your things and leave my house. Tomorrow morning at 9, the sheriff will be here." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Tara was the first to react. She stood up from the armchair, her face flushing red, and started shouting. The words came out fast and tangled. Something about family, about loyalty, about how I was throwing my own daughter onto the street. Her voice cracked on the last word, but there were no tears this time. This was anger, not performance. Kyle laughed, actually laughed, a short, sharp sound like a bark. "Come on, Ralph. You're not going to call the sheriff. You don't even know how that works." Noel shook his head slowly and said, in the tone of a man who's been correcting people his entire life, "That's not how this works. You can't just throw people out. There are laws." Barbara said nothing. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched me with narrowed eyes, and for the first time I saw something behind the size and the rearranged spice racks. She was calculating, running numbers, figuring out what this meant for her. I didn't respond to any of them. I turned, walked back to the garage, and closed the door behind me. I sat down on my shop stool and put my hands flat on the workbench. The wood was cool and smooth under my palms, sawdust in the grain, the smell of linseed oil. The house on the other side of that door was full of people who'd moved my belongings into boxes, changed the lock on my bedroom, and were now sitting in my living room discussing whether my threat was real. 4 people, in my home, telling me how things work. But here's what they didn't know. I'd spent 31 years inside a system built entirely on documents, deeds, titles, contracts, affidavits, court orders. I knew what a notice to quit looked like. I knew what an eviction filing required. And I knew that in the state of Tennessee, property rights aren't suggestions. They're law. For the first time in over a year, I didn't feel like a guest in my own home. I felt like the owner. And that feeling, quiet, solid, unmovable as the oak beneath my hands, was the beginning of everything that came next. The next morning at 9 o'clock, nobody had left. I didn't expect them to. I came downstairs and found Kyle waiting for me in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a grin that said he'd been rehearsing this moment. He had a cup of coffee in one hand, my coffee from my machine, using the beans I'd bought, and he delivered his line with the easy confidence of a man who'd already won. "Threats don't work, Ralph," he said. "We're not going anywhere. There are 4 of us and 1 of you, and you can't prove a thing." I looked at him. I let the silence do what silence does, make the other person fill it with doubt. Kyle's grin held, but his fingers tightened around the mug. "I never said I was going to prove anything, Kyle," I said. "I said the sheriff would be here at 9. He's not here. You're right about that." I picked up my keys from the hook by the door and walked to my car. Kyle watched me from the hallway, still holding his coffee, still wearing that grin. He thought I was retreating. He thought the old man had barked and was now slinking away. An hour later, I was sitting in a leather chair on the 3rd floor of an office building on 4th Avenue North, downtown Nashville. Suite 312. The nameplate on the desk read, Diego Ramirez, Housing and Property Law. I'd found him 2 weeks earlier, during one of my evening sessions in the garage. 214 reviews online, 4.8 stars. The reviews said the same thing over and over. Thorough, precise, no wasted words. That sounded like the kind of lawyer I wanted. Ramirez was in his mid-40s, dark suit, clean desk. He listened to my entire story without interrupting, which, in my experience, is the mark of someone who knows that details matter more than reactions. When I finished, he opened a drawer, pulled out a legal pad, and explained the situation in about 20 minutes. "There's no written lease agreement," he said. "That makes everyone in your house an at-will tenant under Tennessee Code. Annotated Section 66-28-517. For your daughter and her husband. They've been there over a year, so you're required to give 30 days written notice. For his parents, they moved in without your written permission, and they've been there less than a month. 14 days. He wrote 2 numbers on the pad, 30 and 14. "We prepared 2 formal notices to quit," he said. "1 for each pair. I can have them ready by this afternoon." I signed both documents at 3:15 that afternoon. Ramirez made copies, and, this part I appreciated, he offered to deliver them personally. "It's better," he said, "if they're handed over by someone they can't argue with." That evening at 6:30, Ramirez pulled into my driveway in a dark sedan. I met him at the front door. We walked inside together. All 4 of them were in the living room, Kyle on the couch with his laptop, Tara in the armchair scrolling her phone, Noel watching television, Barbara in the kitchen making something that smelled like someone else's recipe in someone else's house. Ramirez introduced himself calmly. He handed Kyle the first envelope, the notice to quit for Tara and Kyle Fleming, 30 days. Then he handed Noel the second envelope, 14 days for Noel and Barbara Fleming. The room went quiet. The television was still on, some home renovation show which struck me as ironic given the circumstances. Noel opened his envelope first. He read the first paragraph, looked up at me, then looked at Ramirez. "Who is this guy?" he asked, pointing at the lawyer with the paper still in his hand. "Your attorney can contact me at the number listed," Ramirez said without inflection. Kyle didn't open his envelope. He held it in both hands, looked at me, and tore it in half. Then in quarters, then dropped the pieces on the coffee table like confetti. "That's what I think of your little paper, Ralph," he said. I watched the pieces settle on the table. Then I said evenly, "The copy is already filed with the court." Kyle's face didn't change, not immediately, but something behind his eyes shifted. A flicker, the smallest crack in the performance. He'd torn up a document expecting that to be the end of it. It wasn't. Ramirez nodded to me, shook my hand, and left. Professional to the last step. I went to the garage. The day was done. The documents were served. The clock was ticking. 30 days for Tara and Kyle. 14 for his parents. Everything was on paper now, and paper doesn't forget. I reached for the garage door handle and stopped. The padlock on my workshop was broken. Not just unlocked, broken. The hasp bent sideways like someone had used a pry bar. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and looked inside. My tool chest, The big one, walnut and brass, where I kept my finest chisels and carving gouges, was open. The top tray had been pulled out and set on the floor. Tools were scattered, rearranged, some missing from their slots. $2,300 worth of hand tools, collected over 15 years. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but everything had been touched, moved, handled by hands that had no right to be there. I stood in the doorway of my own workshop and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Something colder, something with patience built into it, like the slow curing of epoxy on a joint that needs to hold forever. I took photographs, every tool, every empty slot, the broken lock, the bent hasp. Then I added a new entry to the notebook under the sandpaper. The archivist was no longer just keeping records. He was building a case. Kyle, it turned out, was not entirely without resources. He just preferred to use other people's. Within a week of receiving the notice to quit, or rather within a week of tearing it up on my coffee table, he'd found himself a lawyer. Free of charge, naturally. The Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee provides attorneys for people who can't afford representation, and Kyle had walked through their doors with the well-practiced look of a man being persecuted by his cruel father-in-law. His countermove came in the form of a filing, a formal response to my eviction notice claiming two things. First, that I had made a verbal promise of permanent residence to my daughter and her husband. Second, that the house at 1847 Cedarwood Drive contained unsafe living conditions, specifically mold in the basement, which made the eviction retaliatory and therefore illegal. When Ramirez called to tell me about the filing, I was in the garage, sharpening a chisel. I set it down and listened. "It's a standard delay tactic," Ramirez said. "The verbal promise claim won't hold without documentation. No texts, no emails, no witnesses. But the health and safety claim could slow things down if we don't address it immediately." "There's no mold in my basement," I said. "I know, but we need a documented inspection to prove it. I'd recommend going through Nashville Metro Code Enforcement. Official, on the record, no one can argue with the results." I made the call that afternoon. The inspector came 5 business days later, a woman in a Metro polo shirt with a clipboard and a flashlight. She spent 2 hours going through the house, top to bottom, basement to attic. She checked walls, ceilings, crawl spaces, air ducts, plumbing connections. Kyle watched from the kitchen with his arms crossed and a look of supreme confidence, like a man who'd planted evidence and was waiting for it to be discovered. The inspector's report arrived 3 days later. 0 violations, no mold, no structural issues, no code deficiencies of any kind. The house met every standard. The document was signed, stamped, and numbered. I filed it in the folder that was growing thicker by the week. Kyle's health claim collapsed like a card house in a draft. But he wasn't the only one making moves. Around the same time I'd hired Ramirez, I'd also made a second call to a man named Claude Watson, a licensed private investigator based in Nashville. I'd found him the same way I found Ramirez, carefully, methodically, through reviews and referrals. Watson was short, unremarkable, the kind of man you wouldn't notice in a grocery store line. He wore a beige jacket that looked like it had been chosen specifically to be forgettable. In other words, exactly what a good investigator should look like. Watson's job was simple. Find out everything about Kyle Fleming that Kyle didn't want found. The first result came back within 10 days. It was a small thing, an address. Kyle Fleming was still officially registered as a resident at an address in Memphis, Tennessee. His driver's license, his voter registration, his mailing address, all Memphis. He had never formally changed his residency to Cedarwood Drive, never updated a single document. This meant something specific and important. Legally, Kyle had never established himself as a resident of my house. He was, on paper, still a Memphis man sleeping in someone else's guest room. And in a courtroom, paper is what matters. I filed that finding alongside the inspection report. The folder was getting heavier. I could feel its weight when I picked it up. Not just physical weight, but the kind of weight that wins arguments. Watson continued working. He was quiet about it, and the way good investigators are. No dramatic phone calls, no breathless updates. Just steady, methodical collection of facts. The kind of work an archivist could appreciate. Then, about 2 weeks after the inspection, a plain envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just my name, handwritten, and a Nashville postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of a Facebook conversation. Kyle had messaged a friend, someone named Travis, apparently an old buddy from Memphis. The exchange was casual, the kind of thing you write when you think no one is watching. Kyle's message read, "The old man is stressing out, but he's got nowhere to go. The house is going to be ours no matter what. The house is going to be ours." I read that line 3 times. Then I read it once more, slowly, the way I used to read disputed documents at the archive, checking every word for weight, for intent, for the gap between what someone says and what they mean. Kyle hadn't written Tara's dad's house. He hadn't written the family home. He'd written ours, possessive, claiming, the language of a man who'd already decided he owned something that belonged to someone else. I slid the printout into the folder and closed it. Then I sat at my workbench and looked at the wall for a long time. Outside, I could hear Kyle's voice through the garage door, laughing about something loud and easy, the way he always laughed when things were going his way. He still thought they were. The courtroom at Davidson County General Sessions Court sits at one public square in downtown Nashville. It's not a dramatic room, no marble columns, no towering ceilings, just fluorescent lights, wooden benches, and the quiet hum of a system that processes hundreds of cases a week. I'd been in that building before, years ago, when the archives sent me to retrieve historical court records. I never imagined I'd be sitting there as a plaintiff. I wore my suit, dark gray, 15 years old, but well-maintained. I'd pressed it the night before and hung it on the back of my bedroom door. The bedroom I'd finally reclaimed after Noel's deadbolt came off. Ramirez had made sure of that through a separate filing. The lock was gone. My room was mine again, but the house still wasn't quiet. Ramirez sat beside me, his folder on the table, the same folder that had been growing thicker in my workshop for weeks. He'd organized everything chronologically, tabbed with colored dividers. The man was meticulous. I liked that about him. On the other side of the aisle, Kyle sat with his attorney, a young man from legal aid, maybe 30, with the slightly glazed look of someone managing 40 cases at once. He had Kyle's file open in front of him, and from what I could see, it was thin. Very thin. Kyle, on the other hand, looked confident. He'd worn a button-down shirt and slacks, the most formal I'd ever seen him. He kept glancing over at me with that familiar half-smile, the one that said, "I've got this handled." Tara sat 2 rows behind Kyle. She didn't look at me. Her hands were in her lap, and she was staring at the floor. Noel and Barbara were not in the courtroom. Their 14-day notice had expired, and they were technically still in the house. But Ramirez had filed a separate motion for their immediate removal, and they knew the ruling was coming. They'd stayed home. Or rather, they'd stayed in my home, waiting. Judge Fletcher called the case at 10:15. She was about 55, with short gray hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She spoke the way I imagined she'd spoken for the past 20 years. Clearly, efficiently, with zero tolerance for anything that wasted her time. Kyle's attorney went first. He presented the argument. His client and his wife had been living at 1847 Cedarwood Drive for over a year under a verbal agreement with the homeowner. The homeowner had made an oral promise of permanent housing. The eviction was retaliatory and violated the spirit of that agreement. Judge Fletcher looked at him over her glasses. "Do you have documentation of this verbal agreement?" The attorney paused. "It was a verbal understanding, Your Honor, between family members. I understand that." "Do you have any corroborating evidence? Text messages, emails, witnesses?" Another pause. Kyle's attorney looked at Kyle. Kyle looked back with the expression of a man who'd never needed evidence before. His words had always been enough. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Ramirez stood up. He didn't rush. He opened the folder and placed 4 documents on the table, one at a time, like cards in a hand that had already won. First, the property deed, showing sole ownership in the name of Ralph D. Stone. No cosigners, no shared title, no encumbrances. Second, the absence of any written lease agreement, confirmed by both parties. Third, the inspection report from Nashville Metro Code Enforcement, dated and stamped. 0 violations. No mold, no unsafe conditions. Fourth, and this was the one that mattered most, a printout from the Tennessee Department of Safety showing Kyle Fleming's current registered address, a street in Memphis, Tennessee. Not Cedarwood Drive, not Nashville, Memphis. Ramirez explained it simply. Your Honor, Mr. Fleming never changed his legal residency to the property in question. His driver's license, voter registration, and mailing address all remain at an address in Memphis. He has no formal connection to 1847 Cedarwood Drive. No lease, no utility account, no registered residency. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Fletcher turned to Kyle. Mr. Fleming, she said, where are you officially registered? Kyle opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His attorney touched his arm, a small gesture meant to say, let me handle this. But there was nothing to handle. The question had a factual answer, and the answer wasn't Cedarwood Drive. The silence lasted about 5 seconds. In a courtroom, 5 seconds is a long time. Judge Fletcher made her ruling for Noel and Barbara Fleming, immediate removal. They had entered the property without the owner's written consent, had no lease, and had no legal standing. For Tara and Kyle Fleming, given that Tara was the homeowner's daughter, the court granted an additional 21 days to vacate, starting from today. Kyle's face changed, not all at once. It was a slow process, like watching plaster crack. The confidence drained first, replaced by something blank and rigid, then the jaw tightened, then the eyes. By the time the judge dismissed us, Kyle looked like a man who'd walked into a room expecting applause and received a verdict instead. His attorney packed up quickly. Kyle stood, straightened his shirt, and walked toward the exit. But as he passed my row, he slowed. He leaned in, close enough that only I could hear him, and said very quietly, "This isn't over. I've got an idea that'll make sure this house never belongs to just you." I watched him walk away. His shoulders were stiff, his hands were bald, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no smile. I didn't know yet what his idea was, but I knew the look of a man who'd just lost and was already planning his next move. I'd seen that look in archives, on the faces of people whose forged documents had just been rejected. They always tried again, and they always left a trail. Noel and Barbara left the next day. No apology, no goodbye, no acknowledgement that they'd spent weeks in a house that wasn't theirs, eating food they didn't buy, criticizing rooms they didn't own. Barbara took her curtains, all of them, and Noel carried the boxes out to the pickup truck with the tight-lipped expression of a man who blamed everyone but himself. I watched from the garage doorway. Barbara glanced at me once as she climbed into the passenger seat. Just a glance, quick, sharp, the kind that's meant to deliver a message without words. I'd been reading those glances for weeks. This one said, "You'll regret this." I nodded politely. The truck pulled out of the driveway, and just like that, the house went from 5 people to 3. But the remaining 2 were the ones that worried me. Kyle had 21 days, and Kyle, for all his faults, was not the kind of man who spent time sitting still when he felt cornered. Within the first week after the hearing, Watson called me with an update. "He's been researching Tennessee inheritance law," Watson said, his voice flat and factual as always. "Specifically something called the elective share. It's the portion of an estate that a surviving spouse is entitled to, regardless of what a will says." I set down the chisel I'd been sharpening and listened. "He's been looking at whether Tara could file for some kind of legal claim on your property. Not now, but preemptively. Something about establishing her as a future beneficiary, with current standing." "That's not how it works," I said. "No, it's not. But it's the kind of filing that could slow things down, create paperwork, force you to respond, cost you attorney's fees." I understood immediately. Kyle wasn't trying to win. He was trying to exhaust. It's a tactic I'd seen before in the archives. When you can't beat the system, you clog it. File enough motions, create enough delays, and eventually the other side gets tired and settles. It works on people who don't have patience. Kyle had miscalculated on that front. Patience was what I did for a living for 31 years. I drove to Ramirez's office that afternoon. He listened, reviewed Watson's findings, and gave me the same assessment I'd already arrived at. "It has no legal basis," Ramirez said. "You're alive, competent, and the sole owner of the property. There's no joint ownership, no trust, no prenuptial or postnuptial agreement involving Tara. The elective share statute applies to surviving spouses. It has nothing to do with a parent-child relationship. He's grasping. Can it still cause problems? It can cause billable hours, but if he actually files, we'll have it dismissed. His legal aid attorney would likely advise against it. I thanked him and left. The legal front was secure, but Watson had something else, something that wasn't about law. It was about character. Over the previous weeks, Watson had been quietly tracing Kyle's financial history. Not bank accounts. Those require subpoenas. But the informal economy, the loans between friends, the favors that never got returned, and he'd found a pattern. Kyle had borrowed $4,500 from a friend in Memphis 2 years ago. Never paid it back. There were text messages, casual at first, then increasingly frustrated, then silence. He'd borrowed $2,200 from another friend a year before that. Same pattern, same outcome. Money requested with charm, received with promises, and kept without remorse. These weren't crimes. You can't go to jail for being a bad friend with a short memory. But they were a portrait, a documented, time-stamped portrait of a man who took from everyone around him and gave nothing back. I didn't know yet how I'd use it, but I filed it. The folder was very thick now. Thick enough that I'd had to switch from a standard manila folder to a 3-ring binder. Documents, photographs, inspection reports, court filings, social media printouts, and financial records. The complete archive of Kyle Fleming's stay in my house, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by category. An archivist's revenge, you might call it. Not built with fists or threats, but with paper and patience and the quiet certainty that the truth, properly documented, always wins. 3 days before the 21-day deadline, something happened that I didn't expect. It was late, past 11. I was in the kitchen, rinsing my coffee mug, getting ready for bed. The house was quiet, in that tense way it had been since the hearing. The quiet of people who share a roof, but not a word. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, hesitant. Not Kyle's. Kyle walked like he owned every floor beneath his feet. These footsteps were lighter, uncertain. Tara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing an old sweatshirt, one I recognized from her college years, and her eyes were red. Not the performative red I'd grown used to. Not the tears she deployed like weapons. This was different, deeper, older. She stood there for a moment, looking at me. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface, the way I do at my workbench when I need to think. "Dad," she said. And then she started crying. Quietly, without any of the usual theater. Just crying, the way a person cries when they've run out of performances, and all that's left is the truth. I stood at the sink with my coffee mug in my hand and watched my daughter sit at my kitchen table and cry. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't know what to think. I set the mug down on the counter. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I waited. Tara didn't look up right away. She pressed her palms flat on the table, a gesture I recognized because it was mine. I do the same thing at my workbench when I need to steady my thoughts. Seeing my own habit reflected back at me from across the table hit somewhere I wasn't prepared for. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and stripped of everything I'd grown used to hearing in it. No performance, no manipulation, no rehearsed phrases, just words, coming out slowly, like she was reading them off a page she'd been too afraid to open. It was his idea, she said, all of it. She didn't say Kyle's name. She didn't need to. Inviting his parents, that was him. I didn't even know they were coming until 3 days before. He told me it was already arranged, that they had nowhere else to go, that it would only be a few weeks. She paused. He said the same thing to me that he said to you. Just temporary. He says that about everything. I listened. I didn't interrupt. An archivist learns early. When someone is finally ready to tell you the truth, you don't ask questions. You let the document write itself. The bedroom, that was him too. He said if we could get you downstairs, his parents would stay longer, and then eventually... She stopped, swallowed. Eventually you'd just get used to it. That's what he said. He'll get used to it. Old people adapt. Those were his words. Old people adapt. I filed that one away. Not in the notebook. In my memory, where it would stay longer. And the legal stuff, the filing, the mold claim, the inheritance research, that was all Kyle. He found the legal aid attorney, he wrote the complaint, he told me what to say if anyone asked. I went along with it because she trailed off, and for a moment I thought the performance was coming back. The tears, the deflection, the pivot to blame. But she didn't pivot, she just sat there, hands flat on the table, looking at the wood grain. Because it was easier than fighting him, she finished quietly. The kitchen was silent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Outside, a car passed on Cedarwood Drive, headlights sweeping briefly across the curtainless living room windows. Barbara's curtains were gone. The light came through clean now. I looked at my daughter. Not the version of her I'd been dealing with for the past year. The one who cried on command, who accused me of selfishness, who stood in the kitchen holding my coffee mug and told me my eviction from my own bedroom was better for everyone. I looked at the version underneath that, the one who used to sit at a different kitchen table years ago, doing homework while I cooked dinner after her mother left, the one who'd fall asleep on the couch while I worked late on archive cataloging in the next room. That girl was still in there, buried but not gone. "Where do you want to be living a year from now?" I asked. She looked up. The question caught her off guard. She'd been expecting anger or conditions or a lecture, not a question about the future. She didn't answer for a long time. The clock ticked. I reached across the table and pulled a blank sheet of paper from the notepad I kept by the phone. Not a legal document, not a notice to quit, just a piece of paper. I wrote on it in clear block letters, an address on Nolensville Pike, an apartment complex I'd looked up the week before. $950 a month. Below that, I wrote, "First 3 months, deposit plus rent, covered, your name only." I slid the paper across the table to her. Tara read it. She read it again. Then she looked at me, and for the first time in a year, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't strategy or performance or need. It was recognition. The recognition that someone was offering her a way out. Not a way to win, not a way to take, but a way to stand on her own. She didn't say yes. She didn't say anything. She just folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of her sweatshirt. Then she stood up, touched my shoulder briefly as she passed, a small thing, barely a second of contact, and went upstairs. The next morning I woke early and came downstairs to find Tara in the living room with 2 suitcases. Her suitcases, separate from Kyle's things which were still scattered across the guest room and the office he'd claimed months ago. She was packing methodically, clothes in one bag, personal items in the other. Kyle appeared in the doorway around 8. He looked at the suitcases, then at Tara, then at me. His expression shifted through several phases in rapid succession. Confusion, then calculation, then something close to alarm. "What's going on?" he asked, directing the question at Tara, but watching me. Tara didn't answer him. She zipped the second suitcase and carried it to the front door. Kyle turned to me. He straightened his shoulders and put on the voice, the reasonable one, the man-to-man one, the one he used when he needed to regain control of a situation that was slipping away. "Ralph, let's talk about this. Man to man. I think we can work something out that's fair for everyone." I looked at him. I counted to 5, slowly, the way I always do. Then I said 5 words. "Your deadline is tomorrow." Kyle's face went very still. The charm drained out of it like water from a cracked bowl. What was left underneath wasn't anger or defiance. It was the blank, calculating stare of a man who just realized his last card had been played, and it wasn't enough. That evening, Watson's final envelope arrived. Inside, the complete file. The Facebook messages, the Memphis registration, the unpaid loans, the financial records, everything organized and documented. I'd been holding it in reserve, waiting to see if I'd need it. Now I knew. Tomorrow would decide. The next morning, Ramirez's dark sedan pulled into my driveway at 8:45. Behind it, a Davidson County Sheriff's deputy in a marked vehicle. They parked side by side on the street, and I met them at the front door. Ramirez had the paperwork, the court order, signed by Judge Fletcher, authorizing the removal of Kyle Fleming from 1847 Cedarwood Drive. The 21 days were up. The document was dated, stamped, and final. Kyle was already awake. I could hear him moving around upstairs, drawers opening, closet doors closing. He'd seen the cars through the window. He knew what was coming. The question was whether he'd make it easy or make it a performance. He came downstairs carrying 2 duffel bags and a backpack. His face was tight, controlled, the face of a man who'd spent the night rehearsing his exit line. Tara was already gone. She'd left the evening before, her 2 suitcases loaded into a car she'd borrowed from a coworker at the restaurant where she'd quietly gotten a part-time job 2 weeks earlier. A detail I hadn't known about until she told me the night before. She'd been making moves of her own. Kyle walked through the living room, past the kitchen, past the spot where he'd torn up the notice to quit, past the couch where he'd suggested I sleep in my own house. He didn't look at any of it. He walked straight to the front door, where Ramirez and the deputy stood on the porch. He set the bags down on the front steps and turned to me. "You lost, old man," he said. His voice was steady, but his jaw was working, a small, tight motion, like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. "Tara wouldn't have turned on you if you weren't such a cheapskate. You could have had a family here. Instead, you've got an empty house." I stood in the doorway, my doorway, in my house, on my property, and I looked at Kyle Fleming the way I'd looked at every forged document that had ever crossed my desk, with patience, with precision, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows exactly what he's holding. "You lived in my house for a year and 4 months, I said. My voice was level, unhurried. "You didn't pay a single dollar. You didn't take a single step toward anything. You invited your parents into my home without asking. You moved my belongings into the garage. You changed the lock on my bedroom door. You filed a false claim about mold in my basement. You researched ways to take my property through my daughter's inheritance rights, and now you're standing on my lawn with a suitcase, telling me I lost." I paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "Think about that on the drive back to Memphis." Kyle's mouth opened, then closed. He picked up his bags, walked to his car, and loaded them into the trunk. The deputy watched from the porch. Ramirez stood beside me with his hands clasped, professional to the end. Kyle got into the driver's seat. He sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the house. My house. Then he started the engine and backed out of the driveway. I watched the car turn left at the end of Cedarwood Drive and disappear behind the row of cedar trees that gave the street its name. The deputy nodded to me, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. Ramirez shook my hand. "Case closed, Mr. Stone," he said. "Thank you, Diego," I said. It was the first time I'd used his first name. A week later, Watson called with one final piece of information. Kyle had officially updated his registration to a Memphis address. He was gone, legally, formally, completely. The file on Kyle Fleming was closed. I placed it in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet in the garage, behind the tax records and the property deed, an archive properly stored. Tara moved into the apartment on Nolansville Pike. I paid the deposit and the first 3 months of rent, as I'd promised. Her name on the lease, nobody else's. She called me the following Sunday. A short conversation, mostly practical. Where to find a good hardware store nearby. Whether the water heater sounded normal. Small things. Real things. The kind of things a daughter asks her father when she's starting over. She called the next Sunday, too. And the one after that. The conversations got a little longer each time. We didn't talk about Kyle, or the hearing, or the year that had swallowed us both. Some things don't need to be discussed to be understood. Margaret Cooper, my neighbor across the street, 71 years old and the unofficial surveillance system of Cedarwood Drive, waved to me from her porch the morning after Kyle left. I walked over. "Quiet again," she said, nodding toward my house. "Yes, it is." "Good." She adjusted her gardening gloves and looked at me over the frames of her glasses. "I liked it better when it was just you and the sound of that saw in the garage." I smiled. First real smile in months. That afternoon I went into the workshop. The workbench was clean. My tools were back in their slots. The chest repaired. The broken padlock replaced. Everything in its place. On the far end of the bench sat a walnut box, or what would become one. I'd started it before any of this began. back when the house was quiet and the only person who rearranged my kitchen was me. The wood had been sitting there for months, waiting. The grain was still beautiful, tight, dark, with that natural wave I'd never seen in walnut before. I picked up my hand plane, tested the blade with my thumb, still sharp. I set the plane against the edge of the walnut board, pushed forward, and watched the first curl of shaving rise from the surface, thin and even, catching the light from the garage window. The house was quiet, not the tense quiet of people avoiding each other, not the heavy quiet of things unsaid, just quiet, the real kind, the kind that belongs to a man in his own home, doing the work he chooses, in the space he earned. And that, all of that, was the right kind of silence. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.